to be able to tune in whenever and wherever you are around the world to empower yourself with the knowledge you need to balance producing food and fashion sensitive to people, profit, and the environment, because it's tricky business. But here at Serious Country, we're here to help. And if you've just joined us recently as a listener or viewer, I really appreciate you coming to take the time to further educate yourself on the matters that matter most, because we like to help by serving you up more in-depth deep dives behind the headlines from Farmers Weekly to watch or listen throughout your day. Down under here in New Zealand, we have some wonderful advantages, don't we? Our isolated location is proving to be advantageous because of the COVID situation. Our young, natural, pristine environment allows for a lot of envy around the world, and our smaller population allows us to achieve a nimbleness like no other country. It's like our way of thinking is unique in the world too. How we approach issues. Sometimes I'm extremely critical of this because it's frustrating. One thing Kiwis do, we do a lot of talking before action. There's a saying, as a Kiwi saying, called a little less hooey and a little more doughy. And we're maybe not the first off the mark because of this disadvantage, but New Zealand, when we do, as a country, get in behind something, we get on with it. And you think of the first to do a trade deal, free trade agreement with China, first to let women vote, and as released this week, first to be the lowest carbon emitting dairy farmers in the world. Every time I think about our country and what we've achieved, I actually well up because I'm so goddamn proud of my people, and in particular rural New Zealand, our country's biggest landowners. In Serious Country's Opinion Makers show, as we always want to bring you the debate and the thought-provoking ideas from our guests, which are usually industry experts from either the top of the food chain or grassroots. They are all individual leaders and thinkers like no other. And of course, this show continues on that theme. We're going to break down around the Climate Change Commission report that's been released this week. This is the draft budget. We have 4 interviews from the Minister of Climate Change, James Shaw, right through to a technology which allows farmers to prove if they are already carbon zero. I've been able to bring together Forest Owners Association and Beef and Lamb New Zealand on a panel to have a sensible discussion around planting of trees, if it needs to be more, how and where. Kick back, because over the next hour or so, this is when we get in depth. I do like to talk, but I feel like you do appreciate that we get more in depth and we're not restricted by time. There is such a range of views and opportunities on the how. This is no longer about the why. We need to achieve the biggest challenge facing New Zealand's primary sector and, of course, our global population, climate change. Meeting these reduction targets that have been put out in the news by 2035 are ambitious. However, we do have to keep up the fight. Also around protecting New Zealand being a dumping ground for international companies to offset their emissions. It's challenging stuff, and that's why I've allowed the next hour or so to actually get in depth with our guests. Tim Mackle, the CEO for Dairy NZ, is going to explain how this latest ag research released last week has found that New Zealand dairy farmers are the lowest emitting in the world with the greenhouse gases, and not time to rest on our laurels. There is still a lot further to go, but we have the tools in the toolbox to be able to drop emissions without dropping production. Interesting stuff. We will hear also from Toitu Enivrocare, who've paired up with Overseer and Assure Quality to use the existing tools that we have to plug in and create a carbon calculator. This allows farmers to calculate their net carbon emission position, and they may discover they're already carbon neutral. GM for Toitu Enivrocare, Steve Dixon, will explain how it works towards the end of the show. Now, and also, as I stated, a healthy discussion on our panel. Phil Taylor, CEO for Forest Owners Association, and Beef and Lamb New Zealand GM for Policy and Advocacy, Dave Harrison, join me to break down the Climate Change Commission's recommendation for more planting of native trees versus exotic trees such as pine, and how a potential collaboration of the two organisations is underway. Please email me your thoughts on anything you hear throughout the show, Sarah at sarahscountry.com. I love getting your emails, and it helps us to build the future of the discussion around these topics. I've received a couple of questions from viewers prior to recording the show to put to our guests, so I sincerely appreciate that. Minister for Climate Change James Shaw will kick us off to explain his thoughts on the recommendations, which are still draft, that are in process for consultation over the next 6 weeks until it becomes government policy. First off, we'll hear from James on his thoughts.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
Well, when the Zero Carbon Act was announced by incoming Climate Change Minister James Shaw, the idea of decarbonising the economy's productive sector seemed at the time to be potentially financial bedlam for New Zealand. However, transformational and long-lasting change to our climate is also financial bedlam for the sector that we discuss on a regular basis here on Sarah's Country, as they are the ones struggling also with the challenges of managing profitability in a harsh and unpredictable environment. Now, the Climate Change Commission's draft report that was released on Sunday has been trawled through by many media outlets, and it's in depth and it's very hard to find sound bites within. However, our Farmers Weekly team have also been going through this massive document to uncover that whilst recommended ambitious levels on the amount of greenhouse gases the country should be allowed to release over the next 15 years, they are also saying that these targets are achievable with the current tools that we have now and in research without reducing production. Joining us now for his thoughts on how the primary sector is working with the government to successfully implement changes that support our economic powerhouse of our export values, Minister for Climate Change James Shaw. James, certainly been a big couple of days for you, but I mean, this has been in the pipeline now for quite some time, just a lot of other distractions such as COVID and an election.
Yeah, yes, they certainly have been quite the distraction. I sort of feel a little bit like I've been rehearsing a long time and now we're actually on stage. You know, it's that kind of thing where we've been laying the groundwork, putting the foundations down, and all of a sudden it's actually kind of happening now. I'm really pleased with the Commission's draft report that came out yesterday. It's a really solid piece of work. And I guess over the course of the next 6 weeks, New Zealanders will have an opportunity to have a say about it themselves.
Can you explain, please, to our listeners and viewers around the process that the Commission has gone to seek recommendations from what is known as the Biological Emissions Reference Group, made up of a lot of our industry organisations?
Yeah, well, look, the Biological Emissions Group was set up by the previous national government some years ago. They did a terrific piece of work, which was really looking at, you know, based on the technologies that we either have available to us or are on the cusp of being available, and some of the more speculative stuff that may take a little bit longer to get into the market. What do we think is actually possible? And that informed a lot of our discussions as we were forming the Zero Carbon Act in 2018, 2019. sort of used that as one of the key pieces of evidence to develop our strategy. What the Climate Change Commission have done is they've really built on that work and, of course, updated it because things are moving quite fast and there's a lot more information available now than there was back in 2017 and 18. And they've kind of taken a sort of a bottom-up approach, a bit like the Biological Emissions Reference Group did, to say, look, what do we think the economy can do over time? That's a slightly different question from what we should do, but they do also address that as well. But they're kind of starting from a very realistic starting point, which is to say, well, look, if you just had to use the technology that was available to us today, what do we think is possible? And I took a lot of hope from what I saw on Sunday, actually, because it suggests that actually just using existing technologies with no new kind of inventions anytime soon, that actually quite a lot more is possible than we had previously thought.
There has been some commentary and also recommendations from the Commission that to ensure that we have adoption from farmers of these technologies, that rural broadband will need to significantly be prioritised to ensure there is uptake to achieve these goals. Do you take that on board?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've actually been saying that, as so has Damien for some time, that we need to make sure that everyone in the country has got access to high-speed broadband in order to be able to make that leap. The thing is, I can't comment on specific recommendations, A, because this is only the draft report and they give us their final report in May, and B, because government has yet to work through what those recommendations will be. But, you know, speaking personally, certainly access to broadband is going to be critical to enabling the kind of shift in farming and in other sectors of the economy.
I appreciate you can't go into too much detail on those specifics. I do want to talk about, though, that the government progressed to create an environment where behaviour saw what was blanket planting of exotic trees, and the Commission has now said that we cannot rely on that alone. However, the forest owners and those who have an invested interest have said that the incentivisation is what has driven this.
Yeah, I mean, so I would have thought there'd be some quite good news for farmers in the report that came out on Sunday from the Commission, because previously I think we'd estimated that we were going to need up to something like 1.1 million hectares converted to forestry in order to be able to make this shift. What they've said is actually we should limit it to, I think it's somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 hectares, and that's obviously a significant drop. And what that will do, by limiting the amount of forestry offsets available in the system, that really does drive kind of gross emissions reductions that we actually have to see. The other thing that they said about us, and you know, I've had a number of farmers and groups like 50 Shades of Green talk to me about this, is that they want to see a much stronger balance of permanent Indigenous to create those long-term carbon sinks, not just focusing the majority of work on the sort of rotational exogenous forests. So we'll be taking that on board as well.
It's interesting, of course, when you've got such an in-depth, long document, which needs to happen, of course, with recommendations around such a heavy scientific topic. But the big 15% drop in livestock numbers was one that was picked up and has been run with quite significantly. Do you find there is ability to have recommendations on how the industry would be able to be supported to find ways to have more productivity from less, or is it just a case of letting the industry work that out themselves?
Well, I mean, the industry is better at at productivity improvements than the government is, by some stretch. But what they've done is they've projected sort of the historical productivity gains that we've had over the last 30 years, which have been huge, and kind of extrapolated that forward. So whilst they are projecting, you know, a sort of slight decline in actual stocking rates, they are actually projecting an increase in the total volumes of milk and meat that come to market as a result. And I think, you know, there's been some quite good research over the course of the last few years, which has not yet been fully rolled out and commercialised, but should be, about farms that kind of focus on profitability rather than production levels, both make more money, but also in most cases see a reasonably significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions from farm. And I think that's what the Commission are talking about when they're saying actually with existing technology and good practice and changes in business model and so on, actually farmers end up making more money than they currently do, even if there is a decline in stocking rates. Last thing I want to say about that is that, of course, because they're assuming that all of this is done on the assumption of no new technology, but new technology is popping up all the time. And for example, Fonterra announced over the last week that they were going to start working with DSM, the Swiss company, on a methane inhibitor available that's going to work in the New Zealand farming system, and that would have a dramatic impact on methane without affecting stock numbers at all. So there's all sorts of options available.
Yeah, and a cow will not be just a cow when we've got that type of in-depth information feeding into the likes of Overseer as such as well. And I just do want to touch on one particular viewer who sent me in a question for you, James, which I think is really relevant. Our primary sector producers do face a lot of non-trade barriers in the form of unequal farming environments that they exist in, such as Brazil and the US, and they still have to fight in a commodity market around this. How would you like to see it unfold so therefore it can level it out with the huge work that New Zealand is doing to be the lowest emitting dairy industry in the world?
Yeah, look, actually, it's interesting. The incoming President Biden said that he wants US agriculture to be the first sector, the first agricultural sector in the world to become net zero emission. And I'm like, okay, pal, you've got a long way to go to catch up. But so we have this conversation with our trade negotiations all the time, right? And when people say to us, "Oh, look, you're going soft on methane and agriculture," we keep saying, "Well, yeah, but we're the only country in the world that are developing a kind of a measurement and pricing system for agricultural emissions." And so other countries that say that they are more ambitious than us don't have as strong kind of programs that they're putting in place to do anything about it. So they might have a strong target, but a kind of a weak program to achieve it. And so that does come up in our trade negotiations, and we have that conversation with them all the time. I think that you'll see that play out more over the course of the next few years.
And lastly, James, just before you shoot off, I do want to ask you, will there be more financial incentives and support from government into measurement tools and the cost of measurement tools for our landowners to be able to measure, manage and, of course, prove their carbon emissions and status?
Yeah, I mean, all of that fits within the program Te Waka Eka Noa, which we set up with the agricultural sector a couple of years ago when we were working our way through the Zero Carbon Act. We said, okay, look, we accept that the emissions trading scheme it's really designed well for large industrial carbon dioxide emitters. It's not very well set up for individual farms and agricultural gases. We need a parallel system to deal with that at the farm level. And so that relies heavily on having good measurement and management systems in place, some of which has been invented and is looking really good, but some of which is still yet to be developed. And so, we're working in quite close partnership with particularly the levy organisations to make sure that, there is such a system in place.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw. And we'll get comments on this from CEO of Dairy NZ, Tim Mackle, after the break.
This is Sarah's Country. Catch the latest on the matters that matter most wherever you are. Listen to Sarah's Country on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple or Google Podcasts. Try asking Alexa or Siri. Play Sarah's Country on podcast.
Really pleased we got into this. Thanks for your help, Dave.
It's a good idea, honey. You reckon it'll come out? Cover it in talcum powder, leave it 10 minutes, you'll be fine. Good call, Dave.
Good call on getting those security cameras, Dave.
You call a new one yet?
Yeah, kind of.
When you've got decisions to make, we'll be there to help you make the right call.
I'd go for those ones, Bob. Yeah, good call.
Did you choose these?
Oh, you know.
For great advice and insurance, talk to FMG.
Well, there's a lot of viral content on social media, and it's not often it's science research that's being shared around. But over the last week in my social feed has been the new Ag Research and Dairy NZ research that has come out to say that New Zealand's dairy farmers have the world's lowest carbon footprint, half the emissions of other international producers. Absolutely incredible. However, we may know this with our pasture-based rotational grazing systems for our dairy that is predominantly living in the outdoors. And the Climate Commission draft package has taken that into account of the tools that are on the table. However, there is still recommendations to reduce our cow numbers by 15% by 2035. It's believed we have the agricultural practice changes already available to make these on-farm emission cuts, and we won't have to reduce production. CEO for Dairy NZ, Tim Mackle, joins us now. Hey, thank you so much, Tim, for not only coming on the program here, but also all the media that you have been doing over the last couple of days to highlight this fact. However, it felt like the research from last week got swamped by the Climate Commission's report released on Sunday.
Kia ora, sir. I mean, this is a big deal, isn't it, this announcement? A little bit of a Beltway story. I mean, it was headlined for a couple of the agencies, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure all of New Zealand understands the significance of the report yet. A lot of work, but look, it was a great story that Ag Research put out last week. Well, certainly the study that they undertook showing that our dairy farmers have the lowest carbon footprint. It's not news to us in the sense that other studies have shown this too, Sarah, but time had passed and things can shift, so we had to make sure it was done again, and they've done a really robust job, and so it's excellent news. But we know there's now another job to do, and it's a strong base to build from.
There has been a lot of news put out, especially on Farmers Weekly's coverage of it yesterday, whereby the draft package is not as probably scary and maybe not as ambitious as we initially thought out. How does Dairy NZ feel about where it's landed so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, the recommendations for us in the dairy sector are still highly ambitious, and there's no two ways about that. That said, it doesn't appear at this stage, first pass really of this 600, 700-page document, that the Climate Change Commission has recommended any changes to the targets that were tabled in the Zero Carbon Bill. We were up for methane for a 10% reduction by 2030, and it's somewhere between a 24 and 47% reduction by 2050. What they have put out is the suggestion it should be more like 13, I understand, by 2030. And they're saying in the absence of technology that we should be aiming for 24% by 2050. Now, I would, take issue with that off the bat and say, look, let's not assume that we have to have stock number reductions to get that. Let's go for tech first, and we should be going hard out to get technical solutions. And that'll give us options before we have to rush to say, let's drop 15% out. I guess one difference too this time compared to zero carbon is because they've had to do those 3 5-year budgets out to 2025, 2030, and then 2035. They've given an indicative number for 2035, and we haven't seen that before, and it's quite steep. So I think what they're assuming, it looks like, is that with all the changes that would happen, that they expect to aim for a 20% reduction in methane by 2035. So that's hot on the heels of an expected 13 by 2030. So that's the first time we've seen, really, they're looking to say, let's front load this, let's go hard early. Which is a bit scary in the absence of technology. One thing I would say, though, too, Sarah, is I had some correspondence with Dr. Enivrocare yesterday, and he did confirm that the 15% reduction in stock numbers is not a recommendation per se. It's more of an estimate that the Commission has of what might play out between now and 2035 from a range of factors. I mean, there's always going to be some conversion of dry stock to forestry, and there'll always be some dairy going into high-value hort too. They've made estimates on that. but 15 is going beyond that. And we're not sure what the mechanism of how that, but it's an estimate at this point. It's not a recommendation. So let's go for technology first.
And also, in terms of recommendations, the advice given to the Climate Commission from the Biological Reference Group was made up of members of the industry, including Dairy NZ. There has been a lot of comment when it comes to the consultation and freshwater policy. How was the process with Hawaka Eke Noa and, of course, the Biological Reference Group did you find this time round?
Well, look, Hawaka Eke Noa is still very much live and arguably, it's still early days. There's a job to be done that lands us in 2025 where all farmers know their numbers and they have a plan to take action, and there's some various elements. That process is more about setting us up to be able to measure and manage our emissions. It doesn't set any targets, and that's the difference between Hawaka Eke Noa and what the Commission are now recommending first off. Obviously, there's a consultation process now out to mid-March, and then they will then re-release their recommendations to the government, who I understand have till about November to deliberate over this. So that's sort of the difference between Hawaka and this kind of stuff. Of course, Biological Emissions Reference Group, I think, was there. That seems like a long time ago now. That really was tasked, I think, to come up with, what's possible over that time frame. But look, at the end of the day, I repeat myself, 10% reduction by 2030 is still a big ask without technology, and that leads me back to that argument. Good to see the Commission strong recommendation to the New Zealand government that they need to invest in R&D to help us to come up with these tools.
Yeah, and of course, rural broadband is one that will only help with farmer adoption of these technologies as well, Tim. But the thing is, there has been comment that we already do have the on-farm practices in place to be able to achieve this without reducing production. Where has that comment come from?
Yeah, well, look, just speaking to dairy, and you'll obviously hear from Dave about dry stock, but one of the downsides, the upside of being the world's most carbon efficient dairy farmers, it's great for us. Kiwis love being number one at something, don't we? And secondly, it's great for all of our customers and consumers in 140 countries around the world that are consuming our dairy to know that. That's a fantastic thing. The challenge that comes with it is that there's not a heck of a lot of leeway to drop. There's no silver bullet that we can just grab and drop our overall country emissions easily. Because we're already highly efficient. That said, it's an average, 0.74 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of fat and corrected milk, kilo fat and protein corrected milk. That's an average. So what it does mean is that there are some dairy farmers in New Zealand that have more potential with current management systems to drop their emissions. Others do not. And again, that leads us back. We know that because we've been doing a partner farm study across the country for the last couple of years, Sarah. So, look, at the end of the day, we've got, again, it comes back to technology. We've got some potential through management. We've got a program at Dairy NZ called Step Change now, which is about helping farmers focus on driving for profit and increasing that, ideally, but at the same time reducing footprint. So that's around water quality and it's around methane.
So in terms of being able to measure and manage on-farm emissions as of today, what are the tools available to know where those places on your farm you can make some changes?
Yeah, look, it's early days and you've got, I guess I wouldn't want to go and recommend anything per se because various entities have their own approach. I mean, Overseer obviously is a tool that is being worked on around its ability to provide that for farmers. You've got dairy companies doing that now. So, the likes of Fonterra and Finlay and others do, and apologies to those who have missed out, won't go through them all. They are doing that now with farmers and encouraging them at a gross level at least to know their numbers, not just for GHG, but for nitrogen and other measures too. So we're already underway with that. And I think 25% of our farmers across the board, not just dairy, need to have a figure for their numbers this year, 2021, Sarah. That's part of the Hawaka Eke Noa on that journey to 2025. So, look, there are tools out there now. I'll just backtrack quickly just to fully answer your question about technology. So, yes, there are some management potential to make tweaks and make changes that will help with that 10% drop by 2030 for some farmers, others not. and the technology is at various stages right now. So I guess I'm not sure whether the Commission is saying we have all the tools like additives and so on to knock down. I think they know that they are still largely in development. We've got to accelerate that.
So the report that we are the lowest emitting dairy producers in the world is not in the same vein as saying that is good enough, that we still need to go lower so that we can't rest on our laurels?
Yeah, absolutely. And that may be the sort of the hard truth aspect to it for our farmers. I mean, they're feeling pretty buoyed by last week's results that come out from AgResearch, and so they should. Something to be highly proud of, because it does reflect, I think, two things: the unique, wonderful attributes of our free-range pasture system, but not only that, but being highly productive and efficient, because you can't just be pasture, you've actually got to be productive and efficient. And that leads to the second aspect, and that's that our farmers are innovative. You know, they've invested in R&D for decades, and they use it. So those two things, I think, have helped us get to that point of leadership on carbon. But at the same time, you know, the government, in fact, the previous government under John Key, committed to the Paris Accord. The zero carbon bill comes along, whether people agree with it or not, it's a manifestation of that commitment to Paris. And so we as a country have an obligation, and because dairy is 22.5%, quite exact, isn't it, a number, but that's what they say, of our total emissions, then we're a big part of that. So we know we have to contribute to it. At the same time, you know, the other aspect which we can't forget, it's not all about regulations and Paris Accords. It's also about what our customers and consumers expect from us. So, yeah, it's great to be highly efficient, have a low carbon footprint, but I would expect customers and consumers to believe we should be working on that further, Sarah. They use the old sporting analogy of the All Blacks. The All Blacks are not going to want to ever stand still, and we saw that with the last World Cup. Dare I say, you don't want to be equalled in the world, and we certainly don't want to be leapfrogged. So let's remember what customers and what consumers overseas too, and they've got expectations around the carbon footprint of their dairy as well.
It's so true, Tim. To stand still is to go backwards. And of course, we in New Zealand love beating our own personal best, and that's where I think that we need to position this. I believe so strongly in New Zealand dairy farmers because we fenced off a huge majority, nearly 90% of our waterways in New Zealand's dairy farming systems are fenced off and still in places that are claiming green dairying are not. New Zealand, we can do this. It's just about grassroots leadership. I strongly believe. Thank you so much, CEO for Dairy NZ, Tim Mackle, joining us there. Now, coming up in Sarah's Country, we have our Opinion Maker panel, which I'm really looking forward to because on farmersweekly.co.nz yesterday, the AUT carbon report is believed to be overestimated in the sheep and beef farms' claim of sequestration from the Ministry for the Environment. They are also, the Climate Change Commission is suggesting in terms of the planting of more natives versus exotic trees. And so therefore, where does that leave forest owners associations, blanket planting of pine plantations, and the ability for international offsetting of carbon here in New Zealand, but with the opportunities to work together with Beef and Lamb New Zealand and Dave Harrison, the policy GM for policy and advocacy for Beef and Lamb, will join us also on the panel to have a robust discussion around what collaboration really means.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
The recipe for perfect beef and lamb. Take one small fresh country. Make sure it's nice and remote. Now, keep it at the ideal temperature all year round. Next, mix in the farmers. They go perfectly with the nature of this unique place. Add regular sprinkles of rain to really bring out the lush meadow grass. Then let your animals happily graze on this grass, all day, every day. And there you have it, New Zealand, the perfect recipe for beef and lamb. Taste pure nature.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Sarah's Country's Opinion Maker series, which happens every Tuesday live from 7 p.m. and as well on podcast. And what I enjoy so much about this particular series each week is that we delve into a topic in full depth. And this episode is, of course, connected to the Climate Change Commission's draft recommendations around our carbon budget by 2035 here in New Zealand. And of course, we can't talk about carbon reduction or if we don't talk about the ability to offset. And what has played out over the last couple of years has got us to a point where we now have a panel with the CEO for Forest Owners Association on with the GM of Policy and Advocacy for Sheep and Beef, for Beef and Lamb New Zealand. Dave Harrison and Phil Taylor join us now. Hey, thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time to have a discussion around these climate targets.
Morning, Sarah.
Phil, I'm going to start with you. Forest Owners Association has been in a defensive position for a long time towards sheep and beef farmers in New Zealand about taking advantage of a subsidised blanket rollout of pine plantations. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of, in 2021, where the organisation's focus is going forward?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's fair to classify it as being a defensive position. I mean, we've had quite extensive discussions with Beef and Lamb about this, and we've reached a lot of areas of common ground. I mean, I think what we've seen in the media is sort of like an overstatement of the issue, and certainly there are some concerns within regional New Zealand around blanket planting of forestry, and we acknowledge that concern. But we have been working closely with Beef and Lamb, and I think thankfully, what the Climate Change Commission's report has done is going to take some heat out of that debate, because they've obviously identified a significantly lower reliance on plantation forestry, which we agree on, by the way, than the Productivity Commission. So I think that will hopefully take some of the heat out of this land use issue.
Dave, I have a press release from the 31st of January where your CEO, Sam McIver, welcomes the increased focus on native forests because of the multi-environmental benefits that the long-term stable sequestration of native planting on New Zealand sheep and beef farms can bring. Going off the back of what Phil's comments are, what does 2021 look like for the partnership between you?
I think, for us, Phil is quite right that the Climate Change Commission report is a draft advice is very useful in terms of being able to focus the debate on what the issue really is. And I guess if we think about, you opened up with some comments around division between our sectors, and I think the important thing for Beef and Lamb New Zealand has always been to make sure that the correct rules around offsetting, and so that we had climate change policies that drove behaviour across wider New Zealand rather than the idea that you can kind of push it back forever and a day. So look, it's fantastic that we'll be able to recognise smaller blocks, or if we were to follow the Commission's draft recommendations, we'd be able to recognise smaller blocks of biodiversity. We recognise as well too that there is a place for exotic forestry in meeting our short-term or short to medium-term climate targets. But the great thing about the Commission's report is it opens up that debate around ensuring that all parts of the economy are taking responsibility for their own emissions, and for us that's the really important thing.
Yeah, taking responsibility. Sam McIver goes on to say that fossil fuel emitters should not automatically just be able to dump their pollution on sheep and beef land. Phil, how can more strategic planting take place so therefore New Zealand isn't a dumping ground for international carbon offsetting?
Well, I think the policy settings are going to have to be pretty smart, and there's going to be a tension between regulation and flexible land use in New Zealand. And I don't think either foresters or farmers want government intervention in land use controls. I mean, one of the strengths of New Zealand agriculture, forestry, has been the ability to use flexible land use. And a classic example of that was in the early 2000s, where 100,000 hectares of forestry was taken out of forestry and put into more productive dairy farming. So we don't want to lose that flexibility. So there is going to be a tension between getting the policy settings correct and making sure that we use optimal land use for multiple objectives, of which climate change sequestration is one. And I think a lot of it's going to revolve around education. We've heard the right tree in the right place. And that, although it's a bit naff, I guess is a word I might use, it is actually correct. What we need to do is to make sure that we use our rural land to best long-term advantage. And that will involve trees, and that will involve farming.
Dave, when you have a member-based organisation that is funded via levy from a particular type of farming, which is sheep and beef, how does one organisation listen to the wants and needs of policy governance in your role from those members, yet at the same time provide education around the benefits of carbon farming?
It's a really interesting question, Sarah, and I think, and probably the answer to it is that the sheep and beef levy payer is not a single individual, or they're different people that have different businesses, and that's part of the complexity, I guess, of sort of representing the sector is the diversity within our farming model, and it can include incorporation of dairy support, or it can include incorporation of forestry, it can include incorporation of arable, and all of those things kind of contribute towards the success of that particular farming business. So for us, the way to approach that, for certainly from my perspective, is to make sure that the playing field in which people are making decisions around what they want to do with their land, which is their sovereign right, is being made in a way that's kind of gives them freedom and flexibility to adapt, and B, isn't sort of being driven in a way that might lead to outcomes that wider New Zealand doesn't want to see.
Phil, I'm just reading through the press release that Forest Owners Association put out yesterday on this recommendation, and the investment in native trees you do definitely appreciate and understand, but say that it certainly is for more steeper, highly erodible, remote land. Is there not a way of finding a balance on different classes of land with natives?
Yeah, I think it really depends on scale. One of the challenges is the Climate Change Commission's advice is to shift the focus from planting exotic plantations into native trees. And the reality is that is a very expensive option. And so it has to be done at scale, really, to make sense. So to do that, you're going to have large areas of rural land. And I guess the same tension exists with native forests as it does with plantation forests around land that's traditionally been in farming. Do we necessarily want to see that productive land, in inverted commas, tied up in native forest or exotic forest? So there are some opportunities to do small-scale native plantings, we believe, within the rural environment. But again, it's going to have to rely extensively to achieve those goals and those targets on large-scale planting on less productive land, in our view.
It's going to be an interesting one, though, whereby it lands in terms of the income or revenue generated from an incentive to plant natives. And I know a lot of steep, highly erodible, remote Māori land will see this as a fantastic revenue opportunity, as well as how careful we need to be with our Overseas Investment Association buying up land to particularly plant it in native trees. Have both of you got any indications on where some forms of subsidisation may come from native planting?
Well, you have first crack, Dave, and then I'll have a shot.
All right, mate. So, look, I wouldn't like to talk about subsidisation, I guess, because I know, like, part of my role is around trade, right? And so one of the things that we as an export nation have always been focused on is avoiding subsidisation that might distort the market, even though I recognise that, times are changing in terms of environmental priorities and those sorts of things. But, rather than think about things in terms of subsidies, what I do think is important when you talk about native vegetation and that being planted is that carbon sequestration is one of the benefits that can be provided from planting. And I think the Commission's starting to allude to this in saying that, look, there's a climate benefit, but we also need to be factoring in the water quality benefits. We also need to be factoring the biodiversity benefits and those sorts of things that all contribute to a wider environmental well-being, if you like. And so, look, I wouldn't talk about it in terms of subsidisation, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that the planting of a tree or the planting of a type of tree even has more meaning than just its carbon sequestration value.
Phil?
Yeah, I think there's a reality we need to face up with native plantings, and that is that they can range between 5 to 10 times more expensive than planting an exotic plantation forest. The second reality we need to face up to is that they do not produce large amounts of carbon to generate cash in the short term. It's 20, 30 years before you'll start getting significant volumes of carbon out of those forests. So there is a real issue around how we are going to be able to afford to plant the areas of native forests that the Climate Change Commission is recommending in their advice to government. And I agree with Dave around the concerns around subsidies in an international trading context. But I think the reality is that if the New Zealand government is going to achieve the ambitious targets that the Climate Change Commission is recommending around natives, there is going to have to be some form of subsidy, whether we like it or not. There is one other option that the Climate Change Commission doesn't really address in their advice, but I suspect will come out of further investigation, and that is the ability to convert plantation forests into native forests over a period of time. And I think there are some exciting opportunities to combine those two approaches. And the beauty of that is you get very quick and early sequestration of carbon, which generates cash flow. Those forests, exotic forests, are much cheaper to plant. And then over time, you can convert those into a native forest. And when I mean over time, we're talking 50 to 100 years. So I think there are some opportunities in there to explore that option. But at this stage, the Climate Change Commission is silent on that.
Money talks, and the thing is, at the same time is we have some huge decisions to make on behalf of future generations, and so therefore sometimes it's not just about the quickest buck to turn it around as well. Phil, the biodiversity and water quality elements that Dave has just brought up. Do you acknowledge whereby native versus exotic has its benefits for our long-term future?
Yes, I do, but I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, plantation forests have got significant biodiversity. I mean, I was up in the forest last week, and the forest company that I work for owns. It was 25 years old. It was converted from a deer farm. And when I went in there, I was amazed at the amount of hardwood undergrowth, the tree ferns, and the biological biodiversity in that forest was huge. Now, I have a vision where we can see those forests being converted into long-term carbon sinks, converted from exotic forestry into indigenous forestry. And I think there's an exciting pathway there that can overcome some of the financial barriers to establishing native forests. Exotic forests are not biological deserts. They do provide biodiversity and significant biodiversity.
Dave, I want to get to the article that was published on Farmers Weekly where your Beef and Lamb commissioned a report from the Auckland University of Technology, and in a comment that was responded to by the Ministry for the Environment, they believe that the carbon report and the claim that almost all of New Zealand sheep and beef farms are carbon neutral is overrated. It's a one thing to put a report out and then build some complacency with our sheep and beef farmers, yet at the same time keep the foot down on the challenges we need to meet with the Climate Change Commission's recommendations. Is it not?
It is, and look, and I have seen that release from the comments anyway from the Ministry for the Environment, and I think, look, we, as we've said in our response to that, we stand by the way in which our report was produced, and one of the things that interests me, I guess, in terms of the Ministry's response is that they picked a particular number, whereas we'd picked a range of number, because at the end of the day, there is a lot of variability in this, and there's a lot of assumptions that you make in terms of being able to achieve a number. So we're quite happy to stand by the research that we've done, but we need to also make it clear that we haven't done this in a way that's trying to say that we don't need to do anything, or that our sector's done its bit, or that we want to shirk any responsibilities. But the important thing is to have a conversation about, or to generate a conversation about the things that we have done in the past, and that really should, and are continuing to do, that should really be recognised, and that we don't feel necessarily have. So, as a sector, since 1990, we've reduced our emissions by 30% on gross emissions while maintaining broadly the same volume of product. So we've already done a lot of the things that the Climate Change Commission is challenging New Zealand to do into the future. And when we talk about our sequestration on our farms, the 1.4 million hectares of Indigenous native woody vegetation is sequestering a significant amount right here and right now. And so whether it is 30%, whether it's 68%, whether it's 118%, which is the far end of our range, that's probably not the most important thing right now. The most important thing right now is to make sure that there is recognition of what is being done and what has been done, and that that's probably the most important thing.
Dave, I'll get to both some closing statements, but Dave, we do have Steve Dixon from Toitu Enivrocare up to close the show to talk more about the tool that is produced in alliance with Overseer and Assure Quality. Does this research or any of the findings plug into the likes of these farm calculators that farmers can take on board what is existing already on their farm?
The idea for us is to be able to make sure that we can do that in a sort of relatively simplistic way that enables all farmers to do it, because we're partners in Hei Waka Eke Noa, and one of the key things that we need to achieve through Hei Waka Eke Noa is to have, within the space of 2 years, all of our farmers understanding what their net carbon position is, and having in place some form of plan around how they're going to manage that. So part of the reason we're doing the research is to make sure that sequestration is recognised in coming up with that number that farmers are going to be needing to know and understand. But we do obviously have an eye to there being a range of different tools that can tell a story about the climate position and ideally the wider environmental position of farm business.
Phil and Dave, to close, I'd love to get your comments on what does collaboration between both of your organisations look like for the benefit of the landowner?
Right. Well, first of all, we certainly, Forest Owners Association very much welcomes engagement and collaboration with Beef and Lamb. There's no question there at all. And we have been doing that. We've been actively engaging with Beef and Lamb for some time now, and we look forward to continuing that. I think part of our main focus will be to identify the areas where we agree on, and there are many of those, and then to have conversations about the areas where there is a disagreement. because it may in fact be that there are not as many areas as we actually think. I think the other area that we could work very closely on is getting a mutual understanding of our stakeholders' views and positions. And the forest industry is more than happy to share its experience and advice and expertise on the role of trees on farms. And equally well, we would welcome the opportunity to understand and engage with the farming community and get a much better understanding of where their concerns are. And I think if we do that, within the guidelines of the Climate Change Commission's advice, I think that's really been very helpful in diffusing some of these issues. And, and I think if there's one message I would like to get out to the farming community about this, is that those numbers that the Climate Change Commission are talking about, 380,000 hectares of trees over the next 15 years, represents around about 5% of the land area that is currently in sheep and beef farming. It is not a significant threat to the farming community.
Dave?
So certainly from my perspective, absolutely, it has been great to engage with the Forest Owners Association, because I think the key thing, certainly from my perspective, is that organisations will take positions based on a solution they want to see to a particular issue. And I think one of the things that we have been able to talk quite openly and well with in terms of the forest owners guys is that look, there are multiple ways to achieve a particular solution, but what we want to see is there being incentives put on industrial and transport emissions to reduce rather than just through offsetting, right? And so the way you go about that might be different depending on what your view of the solution is, but the important thing is not to jump to the solution to start with and to really understand what the crux of the issue is, and that is where you're able to bring the collaboration. And if I bring that back to the Climate Commission report, I think one of the headline items for our farmers is 15% reduction in stock numbers. Now, again, that's talking about the solution without sort of really talking about what it is that needs to be achieved, and that there may be 3, 4, 5 different pathways to achieve that, and it's sort of jumped on one particular one. So I think in terms of collaboration and in terms of how we work through climate change and what we need to do to adapt as a society, it's important to keep the perspective on what the real objective is without jumping too quickly to any individual solution.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. To hear it side by side has so much weight and value. So I really appreciate your time and coming together, CEO for Forest Owners Association, Phil Taylor, and the GM for Policy and Advocacy at Beef and Lamb New Zealand, Dave Harrison. Now, coming up to close the show, we're going to be joined by the General Manager for Toitu Enivrocare, speaking about the farm certification program, whereby landowners in New Zealand can find their number and find out if they may already be carbon zero. It's an exciting development that is in partnership with Overseer and Assure Quality, and will be a very interesting listen. All that up next here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop and the things you need to live out here.
Like electric fencing.
Or horse feed.
Or bee suits.
Children.
Chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this. But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help your farm,
grow, milk, dredge,
rear, come on in.
Because we're out here too.
Well, we've heard throughout the show from the guests in this week's Opinion Maker, focusing on how New Zealand's primary sector do have the science-based tools already to meet the Climate Change Commission's recommendations of how we will reduce methane emissions by 2035. One tool that is right here for us to be able to monitor and measure what is happening on our land in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the form of a farm certification program. Whereby you can accredit your property as potentially carbon zero, or what you may need to do to get to such status. Joining us to explain how it works is the General Manager for Toitu Enivrocare, Steve Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us on Serious Country, Steve.
Hi, Sarah.
I've been very fascinated by this tool since speaking with CEO Becky Lloyd of Toitu, and it is fascinating how an evolving space of science can get to the point of having a set calculator. Could you give our listeners and viewers a bit of an understanding on the partnerships that Toitu have been working with in the background to come together to monitor such things as carbon emissions?
Sure. So Toitu, this is a sort of a 2-year piece of work to get to the launch of this tool last year. We've been working with Overseer, we've been working with Beef and Lamb, we've had engagement with Dairy NZ, and also Palmu as our kind of trialers and testers out there in the market, out there on farms. So we, being reasonably new to the sector, we're not new to carbon, so we've been measuring and managing and helping businesses reduce carbon for nearly 20 years. So we're very familiar with the business environment, but when it came to the farming environment, we knew we had to find a source of carbon data that was basically the best available in New Zealand. And Overseer has sort of over the years proven to be the most robust source of carbon data, or source of carbon or farm analysis that provides us with the carbon information we need. So we've partnered with Overseer. Overseer allows us to access the back end and take down a farmer's data for their farm. That goes into our system, and then we ask a series of extra questions just to complete the footprint. We use ISO certification, so we're using a certification called 14,064, which is the international kind of agreed measuring and management certification for carbon. So that's useful on farm, but it's also used by all other businesses as well. So it's an agreed standard across 160 odd countries. We use that standard because it's a farmer guarantee not only that their data is right for their farm, but it's also acceptable to pretty much anywhere else in the world. So when you say this is your carbon number for your farm, the fact that you have a certification against a standard will tell Tesco's and any other major retailer or distributor that it's a reasonable standard. So we've been working on this for a while with lots of help from industry bodies and others. And it's been up and down as you'd expect, but we're happy with where we've landed.
I suppose a lot of the questions that have been coming into me overnight for this particular panel from our listeners is around do these sort of standards and the science-based evidence going into the tools and the recommendations from the Climate Change Commission appreciate our uniqueness in our pasture-based rotational grazing systems, which are different from around the world?
Yeah, they certainly do. So when you go through the Toitu program, you will get a unique farm footprint for your farm measurement and for your farm management approach. So Overseer takes into account your stock, your fertilizer, your supplement use, the way you manage your farm, whether you're a twice a day or once a day milker or whatever the management systems are that are in place. It picks up most of those, not all of them, but it certainly will pick up things. If you're planting plantain, for example, it will take account of that. All of that has an impact on your overall footprint. So you will get a unique measurement just for your farm, which then does give us that opportunity internationally to give an accurate footprint, which, like most farmers are aware, is likely to be better than anywhere else in the world, or very close to it.
And partnerships is the backbone of this as things evolve. Will you continue to work as science evolves with the likes of LIC's genetic focus on low emission bulls or gene edited ryegrass?
Certainly will. So the process for taking account of sort of new innovations in the sector is that as those new innovations are tried and tested, and soil carbon has been a major topic of conversation in the same space, as these things are tried and tested and we get a robustness to the understanding as to the impact on carbon, then they'll get integrated into overseer. Then as a farmer completes their overseer a portfolio or analysis, we will collect that data. So we do rely on overseer picking these things up, but overseer have had a significant amount of investment over the last 4 or 5 years, so they are picking these things up earlier. And I know you've talked to Caroline Reid in the past about just where they're going. So we expect that as these new innovations get are proven, get picked up by overseer, we can then take account of them in our footprint.
And
the thing I'd like to add is also that we are able to take into account removals on farm. So we can take into account sequestration on farm from trees, which is obviously a significant component of the reductions that farmers are able to get.
Where is science at with the different types of sequestration? As we've been just speaking with Beef and Lambs, Dave Harrison, of course, Phil Taylor from Forest Owners Association, whereby there is AUT reports that are being contested, even by our own Ministry for the Environment as well, around the offsetting opportunities. It must be an evolving space.
Yeah, it's a struggle to keep up at the moment because so much effort's going into the science. So we as Toitu are actually owned by Manaaki Whenua, which is one of the Crown Research Institutes that are obviously prominent in the native forest and measurement and biodiversity space. So we've got some good in-house knowledge in this space. And again, as it evolves, as there's an agreement, particularly between MPI, MFE and Manaaki Whenua and others around different sequestration rates, we'll take that into account. It'll be built into overseer and we'll draw that down. So we do have to wait for the proof. And there's obvious reasons for that. You can't go out to national market making claims if you have a pretty robust background, because you'll get picked apart.
Thank you so much for your time, GM for Toitu Enivrocare, Steve Dixon there. Now, with the increasing market and regulatory pressure on farmers, Toitu certification is a powerful sign that your farm is ready to meet the challenges ahead, which means greater market access and increased value for your products. Hopefully very soon. The program uses Toitu e-manage carbon management software developed by them, which now incorporates specialised features for meat and dairy farms. The tool lets you use Overseer FM's greenhouse gas emission analysis results to make emissions tracking simpler and more efficient. I highly recommend it as a tool to put a stake in the ground and know where you're at. And you can check out more information at toitu.co.nz. That is spelled TOITU.co.nz. We'll put a link to that in the description on the podcast episode you're listening to now. Now, if you would like to learn more on this particular topic, you can join me. I'm hosting a webinar with the Entrepreneurial Woman with Purpose organisation on Thursday, the 25th of February at 12 p.m, where you can learn more about carbon measurement with Steve that we just had there. Hear from farmers such as Lake Hawea Station and New Zealand Merino on how they are measuring and marketing on their carbon footprint status. It will be great. I'll put a link to how you can join this webinar in the description of the video and podcast episode below. Otherwise, go to entrepreneurialwomanwithpurpose.com. Now, next week on The Opinion Maker, we're going to deep dive further into New Zealand's future advantage with regenerative agriculture. Yeah, there's a lot of opinion on this. We're going to have farmers and scientists explaining how they think we already are regenerative, and we will have those with varying views. I'd love you to send me your thoughts and questions for that Opinion Maker show. That is next Tuesday night live, and of course available on podcast. Send it to me, Sarah at sarahscountry.com. And look out for a brand new Serious Country Facebook group where I invite you to join the conversation around these big chunky topics so that we can gather your thoughts, your questions well in advance so that we can put them to our guests. And of course, have those deeper conversations on the matters that matter most. I'll put the link to the Facebook group in the description below, but of course, check out Serious Country on Facebook. Have a great rest of your day, and we will have another Changemaker episode for you tomorrow, focusing on growing peanuts in Northland, delivering merino meat to your door, a 24-year-old on her agri-governance career already, and more on the boom of farmers putting land in environmental protection with the Toitu Trust. I always love every single one of these individual shows like they're my children, and I hope you're really enjoying the new format of Serious Country into 2021. In the meantime, ka kite anō.